At the end of World War II, there was a brutal execution method used inside of Czechoslovakia and also Hungary, and this dealt with many terrible war criminals, collaborators, and traitors. Pole hanging was often performed in public, and it involved a condemned person being taken up to a 3-metre pole or post, and then an executioner and his assistant passed a system of ropes around pulleys, and they secured the noose around the condemned person's neck. They released a chest sling, and then the executed person passed downwards, and the executioner tried his best to dislocate the neck. But as mentioned, much of this was done in public, in front of crowds of hundreds and sometimes thousands of people. In this documentary, we look at 5 of the most high-profile pole-hanging executions of World War II war criminals, and we see why they went to the post. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Throughout World War II, Hitler ordered his army to rampage into different lands and territories, and these were then brought to heel in terrifying and brutal occupations, which resulted in much death and bloodshed. Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Germans, and Hitler in 1939 declared the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and this left the nation powerless to German occupation and governance, and the country was known as the Arsenal of the Reich, as it was intended to produce a huge amount of armaments, weapons and equipment for the Wehrmacht and overall German war effort. Ruthless Nazi overseers such as Reinhard Heydrich were brought in to oversee these nations, and he brought with him a reign of terror which was intended to keep the country productive and to keep the Czech people at heel. Terrifying persecution laws were brought in, and it was common to see people hanging in the streets to send a clear message to people to stay in submission and to not resist. Herta Casperova was born on the 21st of June 1923 in the town of Trieste, and her father had a humble job working on the railways. However, Herta from birth suffered a disability, and she walked with a limp caused by her right leg, and because of this, while she was at school she was bullied and treated terribly by other students. Her family spoke Czech and also German, and because of this, when Hitler seized control of the Sudetenland following the Munich conference, she and her family were seen as favourable by Hitler. He wanted German families to live inside of these lands, and Herta was given Reich citizenship because of her German origins and roots. She was of dual nationality and was also part of Hitler's Reich. She even changed her surname to Casper to make it sound more German too. But in 1940, she started a new job inside of an office of the German criminal police in a town named Jihava, and she served as an interpreter. As she could speak Czech and German, she was seen as useful by the Gestapo, and with this she was involved in interrogations of many Czech people who were suspected of being involved in the resistance, and because of this she was now openly collaborating with the Nazi enemy. The Gestapo were known for roughly treating those who were suspected of being in defiance to the Nazi regime, and many people were tortured to death or were executed for their involvement. Herta was now involved in the business of working for the Gestapo, and she was an important cog in securing the deaths of many Czech people. Many of those who worked with the Gestapo, the SS or the Nazis in any capacity were seen as the worst of the worst, and many were hunted at the end of the war to be executed for their collaboration with the enemy. She continued to translate for the Germans for a number of years, but at the end of the Second World War, as the Red Army were moving towards Herta's hometown, she quickly left her job and went back to living with her parents in Trieste. But after the Prague Uprising, there were many different pockets of resistance in Trieste, and they targeted those who had helped the Germans throughout the occupation. Different Wehrmacht units then arrived to free a number of imprisoned German people, and Herta Casperova spoke to the German soldiers about the fact her house had been broken into. She even then identified a number of men and boys who had stolen items, and for this action she chose 11 people, and all of those 11 that Herta had chosen were then dragged out to the courtyard of the town hall in her hometown, and they were then executed by a firing squad alongside a number of other rebels. Amongst the executed were allegedly some of the people who bullied Herta Casperova at school, and she got vengeance against them, utilising the German links that she had to have them shot. But the Germans also released her from her imprisonment at the hands of the rebels, and she then ran off to Austria and served in a number of jobs including working as a cook. But part of her employment saw her working for the Red Army, her enemy. However, in February 1946, she was arrested and was then sent to Czechoslovakia to stand charges relating to being a collaborator with the Germans. She was placed on trial for the work she conducted alongside the Gestapo as an interpreter, and also as someone who was responsible for the executions of those who she had personally identified. At her trial, Herta stated that, "I know that I caused the death of several people. I acted out of revenge." She was vengeful, and she knew she would be condemned. The court confirmed her darkest fears and sentenced her to death for collaborating with the Nazis and for treason against the Czechs. Her execution, however, was one which was to be very different, and she was only one of a very few number of women who were executed by pole hanging at the end of the Second World War. Pole hanging as an execution method was common in Czechoslovakia and Hungary at the end of the war, and a number of high-ranking politicians and government officials were executed in this manner instead of using a gallows. Herta Casperova was executed that evening after her death sentence had been given to her. She was walked outside to a meadow on the outskirts of Trieste, close to the castle. On the day before, the head of the Nazi offices inside of the town was executed in the very same way, and Herta was brought out in front of the huge crowd. The pole-hanging post was 3 meters tall and it was 60 centimeters wide. When she was led up to the post, she lost her calm composure, and Herta began to scream and shout for her life, and she even fell to the floor as her knees began to shake so much. She had to be carried to the execution post by the guards who were with her. Herta wore a short dress to her execution, and she continued to cry and scream as she was led up to the execution post. The executioners, seeing her panic, began to work quickly, but they also made sure that everything would be performed correctly and professionally. With pole hanging, it relied on a number of steps, and they fastened a leather strap around her chest, which held her in place and in position in the air on the post briefly. The executioner then secured the rope around her legs and passed it through a pulley system, as well as making sure that Herta Casperova's arms were secured together to prevent a cleaner small drop. He then secured the noose around her neck and then checked his work before he signalled that he was ready. The hangman was stood on the step behind her post, and the sign was given to the assistant to release the drop, and he did so. The executioner guided Herta's neck with his hand and dislocated her neck, and with this she began to twitch and move side to side. But there was a problem as her head began to move significantly, and it took a number of minutes for her to be confirmed dead. A number of Czech doctors came over to her remains, and they checked for a heartbeat, but there was nothing. With this, Herta was then cut down, and she was placed inside of a cheap coffin that lay under the pole, and within the coffin some person had even placed a number of flowers within the wooden box for her. Her remains were carried into the central cemetery in Jihlava, and she was interred alongside a number of German soldiers who had died in the local area fighting during the war. And it's interesting that she was buried in this place, as they saw her as the enemy, even in her death. The execution of Herta Casperova was a huge event for the people in the town of Trieste, and people even brought tickets to secure the best position to see her death. It was almost like a medieval carnival, and for those inside of the Czech town, she was seen as the enemy, and someone who carried out the evils of the German army, and helped the Nazis with their persecuting work. In the translation work she completed for the Gestapo, she was complicit in the torture of many people, and her work helped the Gestapo to execute many accused of resistance. She was executed herself for the collaboration, but also for the fact she actively chose 11 men to be executed, and many of those were those people who mocked her at school. She had vengeance for this taunting in the most barbaric way, and Herta Casperova contributed to a number of war crimes also. But her execution was a huge spectacle, and it was one of the final public executions carried out inside of Czechoslovakia. Kurt Daluege was born on the 15th of September 1897, and little is known about his early life. But when he was a young man, he joined the Prussian army and saw action in the First World War. He served on the Eastern Front and rose throughout the ranks quickly and became an officer, but then he was moved over to the Western Front. However, Daluege did sustain a bad injury to the shoulder and head, and it was claimed in hospital that he was 25% disabled, and at the end of the conflict he was decorated for his bravery, and then he found work as an engineer. But after his experiences in the war, Kurt Daluege then sought to join a number of political groups as he was not happy with the post-war Germany. He joined the Upper Silesian Self-Defense and was their leader, this being a group of World War I veterans who came into conflict with Polish people, but he was also a member of the Freikorps, who were angry with the Weimar Republic government. It was around this time that Adolf Hitler then began to conduct a number of speeches for the Nazi Party, and he rose to gain more popularity. But in 1923 Daluege joined the Nazi Party officially, and he would not be put off following the failed efforts of Hitler during the Munich Putsch. He then joined the Berlin Front, which was a detachment of SA members who had been outlawed following the failed revolution. However, Daluege then rose to become the leader of the SA detachments in Berlin, after in 1926 the banning was over. He began to rub shoulders with the Nazi hierarchy, and was a deputy for Joseph Goebbels, the Gauleiter of Berlin, and was seen as a reliable official, and Hitler also valued him. He was advised to join the SS and leave the SA behind him, which was a good piece of advice, as the Night of the Long Knives would see a huge purge of the SA, with leaders such as Daluege targeted for execution. But Daluege would be involved in hostilities between the SA and the SS, and he was seen as a reliable man with inside knowledge who could help keep them in line. Daluege helped to defend Berlin's party headquarters of the Nazis, and Hitler even celebrated Daluege's efforts. He wrote in an open letter saying, "SS man, your honour is loyalty, my honour is loyalty." But he was promoted and Heinrich Himmler was in control of the southern units of the SS, with Daluege in control of the northern units. Himmler would eventually rise to become the Reichsführer SS and the head of the group, and one of the most powerful men in Germany behind Adolf Hitler, but Daluege is much less known about. He continued to establish his power, and he became a member of the Reichstag, and also oversaw the non-political police. But Daluege during the Night of the Long Knives would also be ruthless against his former friends and allies, and he helped the police to become a Nazi police with their ideology and political beliefs instilled into the officers. Further power and influence came. Then Himmler appointed Daluege as the chief of the Orpo, or the Order Police, and he was now in control of all of the uniformed police officers under the Nazi-controlled lands. Around 1939, with the outbreak of the Second World War, he had control of around 120,000 police officers, and many of these were virulent and brutal Nazis, intent on keeping people down and against dissenting against the Nazi regime. But as the Second World War continued, he was involved in some of the horrific war crimes and executions inside of occupied lands. He personally witnessed a number of mass shootings of Jews in Poland and Belarus, and he also helped to organise large-scale deportations. Daluege's signature was also present on a number of orders for people to be sent to concentration camps and also to be moved into ghettos, and he also witnessed much of the senior Nazi meetings in which they discussed the expansion of the Holocaust. But inside of Czechoslovakia, Daluege became a brutal and barbaric overseer. Following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, Daluege was named Deputy Protector in 1942. A state of emergency occurred following this, and dozens of people were executed in reprisal. It was decided that the revenge attacks would be centred on a number of villages, and those who it was believed had helped to hide the assassins of Heydrich. The Nazis would execute all adult men, deport the women to the concentration camps, and send those children who they believed were suitable to SS families, and they would then burn down the villages to the ground. Daluege was a man who ordered the SS officers to assault the villages of Lidice and Lazaki. The chaos in the villages occurred, and it was horrific, and all of the men of Lidice were rounded up and taken to a farm. Mattresses were taken from the homes and were put up against the wall of the barn to stop bullets ricocheting. Then the shooting occurred at 7 a.m. on the 10th of June 1942, and groups of 5 men were brought in at a time for their execution. This was then said to have been too slow, so groups of 10 were then executed together. Only 3 male villagers survived, and 203 women and 105 children were moved to a nearby school. Children were ripped away from their mothers, who were then placed on vehicles and taken to concentration camps. But a lot of the children who were not said to have been suitable to be Germanised were then sent to the Chelmno extermination camp, where over 80 were slaughtered in gas vans. The villages were burned to the ground and destroyed with explosives, and all animals were also slaughtered. Gold teeth were even ripped from the deceased victims, and Lazaki experienced the same treatment as Lidice weeks later, after a radio transmitter was found nearby, and this had allegedly been used by Heydrich's assassins. Daluege, though, terrorised the Czech people, and he was a man who could carry out the brutal will of Adolf Hitler. He continued in these roles he had until May 1943, and then he suffered a huge heart attack and almost died. He spent a long time recovering, and Hitler relieved him of his jobs and offices, and he was even given a large property to recover at by Hitler. But at the end of the Second World War, Kurt Daluege was arrested by British forces in Lübeck. He was transported first to Luxembourg and was then moved again to Czechoslovakia to face up to his crimes that he had inflicted upon the Czech people when he served as a protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was brought to trial for his crimes against humanity, and at trial he was ignorant, and it was claimed that 3 million police officers were loyal to him and saw him as a powerful figure like Heinrich Himmler. But Daluege, when accused of the charges, said he was just following the orders given to him from Hitler, and he was ignorant, saying he committed no crime. But then he was sentenced to death, and he was convicted of all of the charges. The day after he was found guilty, Kurt Daluege was executed. He was taken and held inside of Pankrak prison briefly in Prague, and during the war this had been a Gestapo interrogation centre. He was taken out of his prison cell and into the courtyard, and there were hundreds of people who had gathered in the prison courtyard to witness the death and execution of Daluege. The crowd was made up of many other guards too, and Daluege was led out by some to the execution post or pole, and he was then to be executed using the pole hanging method. He did not die on the gallows of a trapdoor, and the method would see Daluege secured to a post using ropes, which were passed through a pulley at the bottom of the pole. Daluege was then hoisted up to the top of the pole by a sling across his chest, and a noose was placed around his neck. Then the chest sling was released from around Daluege's body, and he then plunged and jerked downwards, and his head was guided down by the executioner's hands, and he dislocated Daluege's neck. There was a huge crowd that witnessed Daluege's execution, and his death was performed very efficiently. Within minutes of being handed over to the executioner, he was pronounced dead. Kurt Daluege was one of the most brutal and ruthless Nazis of the Second World War, and he was a man who was well thought of by Adolf Hitler. He had a huge amount of power as he presided over more than 100,000 police officers as the head of the Order Police, but inside of Czechoslovakia he reigned over the lands with brutality and terror, and was responsible for a number of horrific war crimes, and for these actions he would be executed inside the courtyard of Pankrak prison. Ferenc Szalasi was born in January 1897, and he believed that he was given power to rule from God through his mother's milk. He lived with his mother right until 1944, and he followed his father's footsteps and joined the army as a young man. He finished his studies and then went to a military academy. He finished this and then was promoted to the rank of lieutenant in 1915, and he became an officer serving in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War. He was on the front lines for 3 years and was based on the Italian front before he was sent to Verdun in the final days of the conflict. Following the political struggles in Hungary after the war, Szalasi was apolitical, and he was not involved in political events post-war in Hungary. He continued to train inside of the military, and he enrolled in the General Staff Officers Training at other military academies. He was seen as an outstanding officer, and it's considered that he was popular and a beloved member of the military. His fellow officers saw him as very intelligent and a very skilled commander, but others believed he was too powerful. He continued to succeed in the military and achieved the rank of a major. When Gyula Gumbos became the Prime Minister of Hungary around 1932, Szalasi became more involved in politics, and he then became obsessed with it. He was considered a fanatical right-wing nationalist who believed that Hungary should expand its borders back to former levels. It had previously had its lands reduced by around 72%, and he then wrote a pamphlet and sent it to other politicians, but because he was a soldier, he was banned from being involved in politics, and was sentenced to 20 days imprisonment, and was then expelled from the General Staff. Following his release, he then served as a staff officer, but then was disillusioned with the army, and he decided to give his time to politics. He first made the Party of National Will, a nationalistic party, and this was later banned for being too radical. But then Szalasi set up the Hungarian National Socialist Party in 1937, but this was also banned, but he did gather support from lower classes and workers. This party was anti-Semitic, but following the German Anschluss of Austria, Szalasi's followers became more radical, and he himself was arrested and imprisoned. But he was then proclaimed the National Socialist Arrow Party leader, which was a coalition of several right-wing groups, and this attracted a large number of people to it. It gained 30 seats in power, and then became eventually one of the biggest parties in Hungary. But when the Second World War broke out, the Arrow Cross Party was banned, and Szalasi was forced to work underground, and he did gain the backing of the Germans. But in March 1944, the Nazis occupied Hungary. Hitler launched Operation Marguerite, and in this, his soldiers were told to occupy the country, and with this he instilled the pro-German Derm Szotzsé as the Prime Minister of Hungary. But the key thing for Szalasi was that the Arrow Cross Party was then legalised, and he was then able to attract more members to the party. But when the Prime Minister was quickly deposed, Szalasi then became an enemy of the Hungarian government, and the regent ordered his arrest. But the Germans in Szalasi had a perfect ally, and the Hungarian regent began to plan to come to peace with the Soviets and end Hungary's involvement in the Axis alliance. But the Germans then kidnapped his son and threatened to kill him unless the regent abdicated and put Ferenc Szalasi in power. A document was signed naming Szalasi as the Prime Minister, and this made the Arrow Cross Party partially in power. He was then placed as the head of the state, and then his government changed the Kingdom of Hungary into a puppet state of Nazi Germany. The Council of Regency was established and approved, and on the 4th of November 1944, Szalasi was made the leader of the nation, and he was joined in power by 16 ministers, half who belonged to his Arrow Cross Party. But whilst in power, he had very few other plans but to carry out the policies which pleased the Nazis. He executed the Nazi Party's beliefs and ideology, and he did this to please Hitler and to stop the Germans being a threat. Along with the Nazis, Szalasi's government recommended the deportation of the Jews which had been paused. His government promoted martial law, and they carried out large-scale executions of those who were considered possible enemies of Szalasi and his party. He also deported thousands of Jews, and many were executed and killed inside of the gas chambers, and despite not being in power for long, in particular 163 days, he had a devastating and deadly effect. He also sent large amounts of Hungarian produce and resources to Germany to help with their war effort, and he forced young and old men into the last remnants of the Hungarian army, being forced to fight the Soviet war machine of the Red Army. When he took control of the country, the Red Army were inside of Hungary, and his authority was rather limited, but his party did deport 80,000 people to the concentration camps. But on the 19th of November 1944, he had nowhere to go, as he was inside Budapest as it was encircled by the Soviet Red Army, and also the Romanian army, as they surrounded the city. This resulted in a 102-day siege of Budapest, but as it took hold, he managed to escape and flee. He fled to a city in the west of Hungary, then carried on to Vienna in March 1945, and then he went to Munich. But as Hungary capitulated and fell to the Soviets, the cabinet of the Arrow Cross Party had fled the lands, and it was dissolved on the 7th of May 1945, the day before Germany surrendered. But on the 6th of May, the day before, Ferenc Szalasi was captured by the Americans, and months later was repatriated back to Hungary. The Hungarians then tried him by the People's Tribunal in Budapest, and many open sessions took place where war criminals were sentenced to death and were executed for high treason. Ferenc Szalasi was placed on trial for high treason but also war crimes, and he was deemed guilty of deporting thousands of his own people to their deaths in concentration camps. He was virtually hated by the Hungarian people, and on the 12th of March 1946 he was brought to Budapest in a town square where he was to be executed. Along with two of his former ministers and a party theologist, the group of the Arrow Cross members were then led to where a number of large posts had been placed. The method of execution for Ferenc Szalasi was hanging using the Austrian pole method, and a few large posts had been set up with a rope attached to a hook at the top. Szalasi was taken up to the scaffold, and he was then flanked by guards, and members of the public watched on. He was placed with his back to the post, and his arms and legs were tied up so he could not move. Then the noose was placed around his neck, and the rope was then tightened, before the executioner took the steps from underneath him. He had been given the last rites before, but the post only left a couple of feet between the hanging man and the ground, and this method of execution in particular led to him slowly strangling to death, rather than having his neck snapped. He struggled and strangled, but then he succumbed to his death shortly after, whilst the public looked on. He was then buried in the new public cemetery in Budapest, but Ferenc Szalasi was considered a serious war criminal inside of Hungary, despite only being in office and power from the 16th of October 1944 to the 28th of March 1945. Despite initially being a military officer, he entered politics and crafted his right-wing ideas. But Szalasi became a man whose party were involved in collaborating with the Nazis in their politics and beliefs, which resulted in the mass murder and brutality of people and their deaths inside of the concentration camps. But he was executed in front of a huge crowd in Budapest.
Born in modern-day Czech Republic, Karl Hermann Frank learned the importance of nationalism from his father. During the First World War, he attempted to join the Austro-Hungarian army, but was turned down as he was blind in his right eye, and because of this he instead studied at a law school in Prague. He was a keen supporter of the Nazis, and especially supported their policy on the fact he believed the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia, should be joined into the German Empire, and with this Frank joined the Nazi Party in 1923. He began to set up different regional districts of the Nazi Party, and went even further in 1925, setting up a bookshop that distributed Nazi propaganda and literature. He became a leading figure in the Nazi movement in the Sudetenland, organising the Sudeten German Homeland Front, which then became a political party known as the Sudeten German Party. It's clear he devoted his life to the Nazi cause, and in 1935 he became the deputy leader of the Sudetenland German Party, becoming a member of the Czech Parliament. The Sudetenland was absorbed into the German Empire and the Third Reich after the Munich Agreement was signed. Frank was a rather radical Nazi and was made the deputy Gauleiter of the Sudetenland, and officially joined the Nazi Party and also the SS on the 1st of November 1938. He then became an SS Gruppenführer in 1939 and was then appointed the Secretary of State for the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia under the Reich Protector at the time, who was Konstantin von Neurath. He was also named the leader of the police in the area, and Frank would begin to impose his power onto the people. He oversaw and controlled the Gestapo, the SD, and also the police in the region, and began to stamp out on dissident Czechs who spoke out against the Nazi regime. This even included trying to force the arrest of the region's Prime Minister, and Frank was a rather harsh figure, who began to become embittered with the Reich Protector von Neurath, who was soft compared to Frank. Hitler eventually listened to Frank's concerns and sacked von Neurath, and began to pursue a harsher and more forceful approach to Bohemia and Moravia after Neurath was sacked on the 23rd of September 1941. To do this, Frank believed he was the right man for the job, and he hoped to be protector himself. However, Hitler decided to make a swift and brutal decision that would change the area forever. Adolf Hitler decided that Reinhard Heydrich was the man to rule over Bohemia and Moravia, and Heydrich would develop a reputation for being a butcher in the area. Heydrich was given the power to enforce all Nazi policies, including race laws within the states, and even could use the army to fight pockets of resistance. One key part for the war effort was that the Czech areas needed to continue to produce materials for the Germans during the Second World War, and it was key that the factories kept turning out cars, weapons and tanks. Frank and Heydrich had many things in common: their brutal ideas on enforcing Nazi policy, and the fact they were strict, ardent Nazis with devotion to Hitler and the Nazi cause. For this they launched a huge attack and a reign of terror onto the area they were entrusted to oversee, and they went on the attack to bring the Protectorate into line. They used the Gestapo and the police to attack any political prisoners and racial opponents, and in particular they targeted Jews to be deported straight to concentration camps without any answer. By February 1942, Heydrich and Frank had imposed their brutal will onto the people, and arrested thousands and executed hundreds in sheer acts of deterrence. They wished to do this to force the rest of the population into submission. However, the reign of terror in a sense was greatly affected with the assassination of Heydrich. On the 27th of May 1942, he was assassinated in Prague, and without a doubt it was a huge moment in the reign of the Nazis, as one of the most powerful and important figures in the Third Reich, the man who was given overall charge and power within the final solution of the Jewish question, or the Holocaust, was murdered by Czech resistance. After Heydrich's death, Frank once again was refused the top job, and Heydrich's successor along with Frank sought to initiate huge devastating reprisals for the killing of Heydrich. They ordered the massacres of Czech villages of Ležáky and Lidice to take revenge on the Czech people for the death of Heydrich, and Frank personally ordered his soldiers to shoot all of the men in the region, sending all the women to concentration camps, and to place the few children considered worthy of Germanization into the care of SS families in Germany, with the rest being murdered. With this he gave permission for the children to be stolen and executed, with the women sent to places such as Auschwitz, and the men were all executed in cold blood. In June 1943, Frank rose to the position of an SS Obergruppenführer, and also took the office of the head of police in Prague. He then rose to become a general in the Waffen-SS, and continued to establish himself over the state. He became the most powerful Nazi in Bohemia and Moravia, and would rise once more. As the war was turning against the Germans by 1944, Frank continued to wield power across the state, and he took it upon himself personally to flush out resistance groups in Moravia, attempting to destroy groups of partisans that had gathered to try and oust the Nazis. He ordered large-scale attacks on groups of partisans and resistors, but the German army were unable to destroy many of the groups. Frank continued to exercise terror over the state, ordering summary executions of those men and women suspected of not just being partisans, but even expressing the smallest part of support for them. He believed that he personally defeated the partisans, but this was not the case. As the Nazis' empire crumbled around them, Prague stayed in the control of the Nazis. It was the last city amongst the major European ones to be freed. Karl Hermann Frank was defiant in his stance to defend the city from any attackers, and on the 30th of April 1945 he made a broadcast over the radio. He said that if an uprising should occur, then he would drown anyone involved in the sea of blood, before ordering the streets to be cleared of anyone, and that the army and police should shoot anyone on sight. With this, the streets of Prague became a bloodbath, with many being simply executed for just leaving their homes. Frank knew he was a war criminal, and because of this he tried to flee the Soviets who were advancing towards the city. He handed himself over to the Americans at Plzeň on the 9th of May 1945. He was then placed on trial in 1946 and was represented by a Czech lawyer, which caused him great embarrassment, and at trial evidence of the horrific massacres he had ordered were told. For this he was sentenced to death after being convicted of the war crimes and the destruction and devastation of Czech villages in reprisals. On the 22nd of May 1946, in a courtyard outside Pankrat prison in Prague, a huge crowd gathered to watch the execution of Karl Hermann Frank, the man who had imposed such terror onto the population. Thousands of people packed into the streets to watch the execution of the Nazi, and his execution was captured on tape. The method of execution was a Hungarian pole hanging method, and it was said, those of Lidice's widows who were able to come, and the widows of some 30,000 other Czechs for whose execution Frank had been adjudged indirectly responsible, occupied the second row of seats. Not the slightest gleam of compassion could be seen in that row of unforgiving eyes as Frank, dressed in a ragged Nazi elite guard uniform, walked quietly between the two guards. As the noose was adjudged around his neck, Frank muttered, "Germany will live, even if we do not live." With this he was then hanged from the pole, in front of thousands of spectators who must have felt a sense of justice, with the former horrific leader dying and taking his last breaths. It was said that the spectators watched quietly in the bright sunshine as Frank was executed. After his death, an autopsy was carried out before he was buried in an unmarked grave in Prague. Allegedly, his hangman took the noose from around his body and then lost it after he drank heavily in a bar one evening. Karl Hermann Frank was a despicable man who since his youth believed that the German state was much superior to others, and with this followed his beliefs to become one of the most dangerous and powerful men across the Nazi state. His crimes and brutality were unmatched, and together with Reinhard Heydrich, they became a pair known for the horrific destruction of the innocents. He was a man who did meet justice at the end of the Second World War. However, ultimately it was long after he had inflicted so much suffering and hatred onto so many.
There were many countries that fell under German occupation and Axis influence during the Second World War and collaborated with the Nazis. On the 25th of March 1941, Yugoslavia joined the Axis alliance, and this allowed the Germans to travel through their land to Greece. But the Axis powers later partitioned Yugoslavia, and inside of the different territories, there was a huge amount of terror which was carried out. Different groups such as Ustasha militia instigated a reign of brutality upon people and civilians, and there were widespread executions and deportations to concentration and extermination camps. Lili Böhm was just 20 years old when she was executed, and very little is actually known about her life. She, during the Second World War, joined a Jewish youth organisation known as the Young Guard in her local town of Novi Sad. But during the conflict, her part of the country was invaded by the Hungarian military and army, who were in collusion with the Nazis. There were many people who did resist, and often resistance was met with the most brutal of reprisals, and people suspected of subverting occupying forces could be tortured, sometimes even to death. Lili Böhm got involved in the organisation of resistance activities against the Hungarians, and she also took part in groups who sabotaged Hungarian soldiers. This was a crime that carried the death sentence, and Lili Böhm knew how dangerous it was for her to resist. Being a woman too, she knew that she could be subjected to other horrors if she was also caught. But it was not long before she fell into the hands of her enemies. On the 20th of September 1941, Lili Böhm was caught by the Hungarian gendarmerie and the occupying police forces. Specifically on her person, she was carrying a weapon, and further investigations turned up that she was part of resistance cells, and that she was either harbouring and hiding weapons for resistors, or that she intended to use the weapon against Hungarian occupation forces. It's not known specifically what her intention was that day, but the crime of carrying a weapon was enough for her to be sentenced to death. It's assumed that she had a rough ordeal in prison locked up too, and the military court confirmed her execution. For a couple of months, Lili Böhm was left inside of a Hungarian-occupied prison in Újvidék, and she was held alongside other suspected resistors, but she was to be executed by pole hanging. On the 25th of November 1941, Lili Böhm was led out of her prison to her execution, and she was accompanied by a number of guards. Some of them walked her to the execution post, and she was greeted by the executioners who would take her life on the post. There was a large crowd gathered by the occupying forces to witness her execution, and the soldiers hoped that seeing this 20-year-old woman be executed in front of them would be enough to put the crowds off committing serious offences, and most importantly, prevent them from joining resistance groups and cells. With regards to Lili Böhm's execution method of pole hanging, it was a variation of the short drop execution method, and it was used inside different lands and countries such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It used a pole or post for the gallows, and there were different steps for it to be carried out. It was referred to as the Vergelegen, which translates as the strangling gallows, and it appeared to crowds a rather brutal execution method. There were a number of steps, and the condemned was brought to the post or pillar, which was usually 3 meters tall, and then ropes were attached to the condemned. A rope was attached around their feet, and it was then secured through a pulley system at the bottom and base of the post, and the condemned were held in the air by a chest sling, which passed over their body and under their arms. This held them still before the drop, and then the noose was secured around the neck of the victim, and the noose was secured to a hook at the top of the pole, and then the death sentence was usually read. Next, the chest sling was released, and the victim then jerked downwards, and the assistant executioner used a foot rope to guide the fall, and the executioner was usually more senior and experienced, and he would be stood on the platform behind the post. It was his job to place the heel of his hand under the jaw of the condemned, and this would increase the force on the neck and make this greater at the end of the drop, and the executioner, it was said, would manually dislocate the neck of the condemned by thrusting and forcing their head to one side. Pole hanging was considered by some to have been a much more humane and quicker execution method than even using the gallows, and it took roughly around a minute for someone to die when performed successfully. It was this fate that Lili Böhm suffered. She was led up to the post and was held on it by a chest sling, and the executioner then secured the ropes around the pulley system and her body, and then the noose was secured around her neck. Her post, though, was not too tall, and it was certainly not 3 meters tall, and the executioner and his assistant then worked together to bring her life to an end. She was wearing a dark dress, and she had her arms secured to the post, and had no chance of escaping her fate on the execution post, as she was surrounded by many different Hungarian guards. These showed their collaboration to the Axis forces and alliance, as they were even wearing the classic German Stahlhelm, and to prevent people saving the young 20-year-old Lili Böhm, 2 guards stood directly next to her body, and they guarded closely over it. Lili Böhm was not the only woman who was subjected to a fate like this during the Second World War. There were many young women who were arrested and were seized for allegedly being involved in resistance against the Germans or the Axis forces. It was a very dangerous time, and Lili Böhm, let's remember, was a Jewish woman who knew the persecution that was coming if she did not join the resistance, and she fought the occupation that she was forced to live under. She was executed for rather flimsy reasons, carrying a weapon in public, which during a time of conflict and war was not necessarily a huge shock. She may have had this on her person for personal protection, but as she was discovered to have been part of a resistance group, the Young Guard, this was enough for her to be sent to her execution. She likely had a rough interrogation ordeal before she was sentenced to death, and her body was left on the post for a while, so that a clear message could be sent to those in the local area. This was done to deter other people from joining the resistance, and was done to make people fall into line and not take up arms against the German enemy or the Axis enemy. One of the greatest fears of the Axis forces, who rolled into many different countries during World War II, was resistance, and to them, everyone was a suspect. Lili Böhm was just a young 20-year-old woman when she was dragged to her execution on the post in front of a large crowd. There were teenagers who were executed by occupying forces during World War II, with some being hanged from trees for their suspected or confirmed resistance, and Lili Böhm's story is one which is not the most well known, and she deserves to be remembered for her actions in standing up to her enemies inside of her homelands. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.